Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're having a great one. Today I want to talk about the C word, and by that I mean coalition governments. Because in Canada we don't see a whole lot of them, yet they come up from time to time, especially as we head into major elections. And in this case, going into the 2019 federal election, you're seeing some conservative commentators like Spencer Fernando really make the case that a coalition government is going to be a left-wing coup against a potential Scheer minority victory, and that the Liberals and Greens and NDP are going to unite to destroy our energy economy and to, in general, take the power that they didn't win. And this is something that the Conservatives usually like to use. It was something that Stephen Harper did. Stephen Harper, when the NDP and the Liberals kind of nearly formed a coalition in the late 2000s, he argued that it would have been nothing less than a coalition of losers, which would have basically led to, dysfunction, and it would have been a bastardization of our democracy, and on and on and on. But in this video, I want to make the case that coalition government is both legitimate in a legal sense, but also in a kind of moral/political sense. And I want to talk about these things. First, I think it's important to recognize how our electoral system works. The way it works is that we don't actually elect our prime minister. I know the way political campaigns are run are very leader-centric at the provincial and at the federal levels. If you examined, the recent Alberta election, it wasn't the UCP versus the NDP so much as it was Rachel Notley versus Jason Kenney, at least in terms of the popular discourse, right? And here in Ontario, a lot of it was Ford versus Horwath versus Wynne, and it was sometimes less about the parties themselves. The personalities really matter. But when it comes down to the actual votes, it's not one general federal election as much as it's 338 mini elections taking place in Canada, all at the same time. And the winners of those elections, most of them will have party banners, although independents do from time to time win, form up the parliament. And it's not necessarily the case that the leader of the party with the most seats has to become prime minister. Because at the end of the day, the parliamentarians themselves have the power to select or deselect a prime minister. Because a prime minister in Canada governs, first and foremost, off the ability to keep the confidence of the House. If he or she cannot do that, they either need to give someone else a chance to do it, or we need another election. And that's where the Governor General will step in. Often they'll have to make a decision about whether or not we need a new election or not, or whether or not they can give somebody else a try. So this means that in a hypothetical situation where a party wins the most seats, but not enough to form a majority, not enough to get 50% plus one of the seats, whatever the rounding is, then the other parties, a combination of the other parties, could well form a coalition to stop them. Or that ruling party with a minority might form a coalition with a smaller party to give themselves more stability. Neither of those things are illegitimate. They are a respectable form of parliamentary negotiations that happen in multiple countries, many of which have the same British parliamentary traditions as Canada does. If Andrew Scheer wins the most seats, he is not automatically prime minister. He does not get to decree that he is prime minister by divine right because he got 145 seats and the Liberals only got, say, 120, and, the NDP gets, 30, 40 seats, and the Greens get a few, and the Bloc get a few, and, etc. A hypothetical situation. Andrew Scheer is not automatically prime minister. The way it works is the last prime minister is given the right to form a government until proven otherwise. So if on election night Andrew Scheer wins the most seats, but Justin Trudeau feels he can form a minority government with another party or parties, he can go to the Governor General and say, I have the confidence of the House still. I can pass a throne speech, I can pass a budget, I can do all of these things because I have the support of the Commons. I don't need to have the support of the leader of the party with the biggest seats because I have support of the Commons. That is a legitimate form of governance. And again, while a lot of this concern comes from conservatives, they're worried about, a left-wing coalition that will commit a coup against an Andrew Scheer minority government. The reality is Andrew Scheer could do this if he wanted to. Andrew Scheer could go to another party and say, hey, look, we want to depose Justin Trudeau from government, and he won 150 seats, but, the Conservatives plus those other parties equal more than that, equal enough to form a majority. We're going to take power. And Justin Trudeau could go to the Governor General and say, look, I still feel I have confidence. The Governor General might let him test the House, but what will almost certainly happen is that so soon after an election, if Justin Trudeau's government is defeated so soon after that election, almost certainly Andrew Scheer would be given a chance to govern based on his coalition. And so from a constitutional perspective, those who call coalitions illegitimate or a coalition of losers or a coup against, conservative governments or governments that they support, they have no leg to stand on, in my view. And this applies to both formal coalitions, a formal coalition being where, the ruling party will give seats in cabinet and will actually include the minor parties in the operation of the government. We don't see those too often in Canada, but you see those a lot in Europe. Or the more common example in Canada, which is less a coalition and more a semi-formalized kind of supply agreement, where the major party will form government and the minor party, based on concessions that they want from that government, will agree to uphold the government for a certain term or for as long as those conditions are upheld. And that form of government has been done in Canada and is currently being done in Canada with the BC Greens and the BC NDP. The BC Greens don't have any seats in that cabinet, but they are in a sense imperative in allowing that NDP government to exist, because without them, the Liberals would have won the plurality of seats. And so the Greens and the NDP, cooperating together, were able to take power despite the fact that they were not the parties that had the most seats in the election. It's a perfectly legitimate form of government, and it has lasted for longer than 2 years now, or about 2 years now, give or take. And in other provinces as well, there have been cases like this. There have been cases at the federal level. For example, in the 60s and 70s, there had been deals of this sort, loose deals, in a sense, between the NDP and the Liberals, where, the NDP was able to get concessions from the Liberals, and the Liberals were in turn able to stay in power. So from that sense, these are perfectly legitimate forms of government. Don't listen to the fear-mongering that this is some sort of coup against, our venerable Canadian democratic traditions. This is in line with those traditions and perhaps respects them more deeply than other forms, because it recognizes one thing above all. The Prime Minister and his cabinet, they are not supreme. They are not sovereign. The Parliament is sovereign, and that includes everyone in the Parliament, and not just the people in that Parliament who happen to come from the party with the most seats when that Parliament is formed. But the constitutional part is easier. The politics of it are, I think, where a lot of people are a little bit more concerned. And this is where Stephen Harper was able to sow discord when he talked about, the coalition against him being a coalition of losers, arguing that if the Canadian public wanted a Liberal or an NDP government, they would have voted for it, but what they voted for was a Conservative minority government, and that's what they should have. And he's saying that this coalition is a disregard for the mandate Canadians sent to the Parliament. That was his argument. But I don't buy that, because again, the reality of how we elect our system is we don't elect governments. We elect MPPs or MPs or MLAs or MHAs, whatever you call them in your jurisdiction, who then effectively constitute the government or sit in opposition to that government. Another factor for me is representation and inclusion. And the reality of our political system, even in minority parliaments sometimes, is that absolute power, or much of the power, goes to one political party, even though that political party often has less than 40% of support from the electorate. And look, I don't think that's conducive. I don't think that leads to a diversity of representation. I think it leads to a winner-take-all system of politics that encourages conflict where it's not always needed. It encourages different regions pitted against one another, because there are entire regions that aren't included within one party but are entirely included with another. The reality is that it's the winner-take-all system leads to a sort of politics that's distortionary of the actual will of the Canadian public, of the voting public. So if you get, like we did in 2011 or throughout much of the 90s, liberal or conservative majority governments that often lacked well short of 50% of the vote, or even if you get a conservative minority government in the kind of mid-2000s era that, didn't have absolute power, but formed a government based on the fact that only about a third of the country supported them, you see the problem there. It leads to conflict and it leads to a lack of diverse voices around the room. Let's look at BC as an example. In that BC election, the NDP and the Liberals effectively tied, both in popular votes and seats. It was very close on both counts. And the Green Party only got 3 seats, because the first past the post system is broken, and I can talk about that in other videos. The point being, if either the NDP or the Liberals in BC formed a singular government because they were able to eke out a majority, or they were able to sort of just govern without the support of another party, it would effectively mean that the reins of power were held by a party that had far less than 50% support. But in formalizing an agreement between the BC NDP and the BC Greens, they formed a sort of soft coalition that not only is legitimate in a constitutional sense, but represents a majority of seats in the legislature and represents well over 50% of the entire electorate. So therefore, when you think of what that government can do, it is more likely, not fully likely, not guaranteed of course, but it is more likely to adequately represent the will of the voting public of British Columbia. So in a hypothetical case where the Conservatives, say, win the most seats, but the Liberals and NDP and Greens form a coalition, that coalition could, one, form a majority of seats between them potentially, but it could almost certainly be the kind of coalition that could have 60% of the total vote, and therefore have real democratic legitimacy in a way most minority and majority governments don't have. This is why coalitions can have real value. There's compromise, so that, the policy framework of the government won't just represent one party that gets 30-40% of the vote, but could represent multiple parties that get 50-60% of the vote. It's more likely to not exclude entire regions. For instance, as the Liberals form a majority government, they have no representation in Alberta, basically. They're largely absent in entire regions. And on the flip side, they have a disproportionate control of the Maritimes. In a coalition government, there would be greater potential for regional diversity. That's a good thing if we're constantly worried about separatism and alienation, be it from Quebec or be it from Alberta or, the West more generally. These are important things to consider. Coalition governments could not only bring viewpoint diversity, but also geographic diversity. So we're going to be going into a federal election, and it's important to realize that the outcome is still yet to be determined. If you look at the polling right now, Andrew Scheer seems to have a leg up. But people are largely putting him in a minority position right now. How that exactly shapes up will determine the talks of coalitions. Can the Greens and Liberals and NDP form a coalition? Do they require the support of the Bloc, which will make it trickier because people are generally concerned about including, a Quebec Nationalist Party in a Federalist coalition? All of these things are wrinkles that we yet don't have to talk about because we don't see them yet. But it should be made clear that if there are talks about coalitions, it is irresponsible and disingenuous to reject them outright, because a coalition government is a democratic representation of the people's vote. And I can't underline this enough. This isn't purely partisan. It's partisan right now because much of the fear-mongering against any potential coalition is coming from the right, but it doesn't have to be partisan. It doesn't have to be. Andrew Scheer has the same ability that Justin Trudeau would or Jagmeet Singh would to potentially form a coalition government if the opportunity arises. And if he has those means available to him, and if he's willing to compromise with those potential coalition partners, then Andrew Scheer should have all the opportunity in the world to form a coalition. So that's where we are. Remember this. When you hear people talk about coalitions as a coup or as, a gathering of losers to take out the real winner, remember this. Tell them, one, The government can only rule with consent of the parliament, and that includes the opposition parties. Tell them, too, that our current system of first-past-the-post elections often leads to one-party rule that doesn't represent the geographic and ideological diversity of this country. And tell them, 3, that a coalition system could help rectify some of the limitations of that first-past-the-post system because it more accurately represents and includes the sum of voters that have voted in the election. So that's my call to action in this video, is that we need to collectively as Canadians educate each other, inform one another that coalition governments are perfectly legitimate. They're perfectly legal, they're perfectly moral, they're not anti-democratic, they don't distort the will of the people. In fact, they are more democratic and they are more in tune with the will of the people than most one-party rule governments could ever hope to be. So let's go talk to our neighbors and our friends and our colleagues. I don't care which party you support. Again, I've talked about this multiple times on my channel. I am a card-carrying NDPer. I don't hide that fact because I feel if I hide that fact, people won't be able to judge my views for what they are. They'll always think I have a hidden agenda. I have partisan biases, but I share them with you. And whether you're a conservative, or you're a liberal, or you're a green, or you're the bloc, or you're a People's Party person, it doesn't matter. The coalition system of government is perfectly legitimate. So guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you liked, commented, and subscribed. It helps to share the message far and wide, and it helps me to grow the channel. Likewise, I also have a Patreon account. So if you have the ability and desire and means, I would really appreciate your support there. Your contribution, even just a couple of bucks a month, really helps to improve both the quality and quantity of content on this channel. So guys, thanks for watching again. Have a great one, and I'll see you in the next video.